I was standing outside the Guelph City Hall on a Tuesday in November, holding a sealed envelope with my tender bid inside it, when I realized I hadn't smelled wet clay in 19 months. That's what I was thinking about. Not the number I'd written on the bid form, not the property that would either be mine or not in 40 minutes, not the woman next door, who had spent 14 months making it her personal mission to make sure I never worked again. I was thinking about the studio at 6 in the morning. The particular wet earth smell of raw stoneware being wedged by hand before the students arrived, when the kiln from the night before was still faintly warm, and the whole room felt like something ancient, being turned into something new. My mother bought that smell, in a manner of speaking. She spent 21 years teaching grade 4 in Waterloo before she moved to Guelph and used her savings. Not a dramatic sum, nothing inherited, just the careful accumulation of a person who didn't spend much and planned quietly, to buy a double-lot Victorian on Cardigan Street with a detached workshop at the back. She was 53 years old when she signed those papers. She converted the workshop into a ceramic studio and called it Thornhill Clay, and she taught classes out of it for 11 years before her hands made throwing on the wheel too difficult to continue. When she passed, I was 31 and working a marketing contract in Toronto that I was reasonably good at and genuinely indifferent to. She left me the building, the equipment, 12 hand-labeled binders of class notes organized by technique and glaze chemistry, and a mortgage with 14 years left on it. She also left me, I've since decided, her complete inability to walk away from something she'd started. I moved back to Guelph. I spent 4 months learning the actual business, the permits, the insurance, the liability waivers for classes, the HST filings, and another 8 months before I felt confident enough to hire my first employee. A ceramicist named Opal, who had been one of my mother's longtime students, and who cried quietly when I offered her the position. Within 3 years, Thornhill Clay had 9 employees, a 6-month waitlist for the signature weekend intensives, and a wholesale account with 4 design boutiques in Toronto and 1 in Ottawa. We had a small retail counter in the front of the building that sold finished pieces and supplies, and on Saturday mornings, the front walkway was lined with people who'd registered months earlier and driven from as far as Hamilton to be there. I want you to understand what this place was before I explain what happened to it. My neighbor moved in next door in the spring 3 years ago. She bought the adjacent property at what I later understood was close to the top of the market. A character home that had been a rental for decades and needed substantial work, and she arrived with a contractor and renovation plans and a very settled idea of what the neighborhood should look like. She introduced herself at my front door with a bottle of Niagara Riesling and managed, in the same 5-minute conversation, to mention what she'd paid for the house, what she intended to flip it for, and that she found the parking situation on our street a real concern from a safety standpoint. I didn't think much of it at the time. People renovate. People have opinions. The first bylaw complaint arrived 6 weeks later. A noise complaint filed with the city at 9:17 a.m. on a Saturday, alleging that mechanical equipment at my property was creating a neighborhood disturbance. The equipment in question was a Brent pottery wheel. Our Saturday morning class had been running from 9 to noon for 6 years without a single complaint from anyone on the block. A bylaw officer came out, listened for approximately 5 minutes, noted there was no violation, and closed the file. 3 weeks after that, a complaint alleged that emissions from our kiln were creating an air quality hazard. A fire department inspector reviewed our ventilation documentation, tested the exhaust levels, and confirmed everything was well within code. The third complaint, parking blocking emergency vehicle access, was closed even faster. Our students used the municipal lot 2 blocks over. They had been directed there for years. There was no blockage. I want to be honest about something. Each closed complaint still costs you. There's the time lost gathering documentation, the afternoon production you lose when an inspector arrives, and the kilns have to go cold. The insurance premium that my broker adjusted upward after the fire department visit, not because we'd failed the inspection, but because a complaint had been filed, and filed complaints trigger reviews, and reviews trigger adjustments. That cost me $340 more per year, permanently, for something that wasn't my doing. I went to talk to her. It was December by then, and I brought a tin of shortbread, because my mother had raised me to lead with something rather than nothing. I knocked, she answered in a blazer, at 7 in the evening, and I said I'd been thinking about her concerns and wanted to see if there was something we could work out between neighbors, directly. She smiled, a careful, social smile, and said she didn't have any concerns personally. She was simply a community member exercising her right to report potential bylaw issues, and she hoped I had a wonderful holiday season. I went home and ate most of the shortbread myself. Over the 10 months that followed, she filed 14 more complaints: a zoning concern, a noise complaint about the exhaust fan timing, an allegation about the outdoor signage dimensions, a claim that the studio's rear fence encroached on a shared property line, which a surveyor disproved for $600 I had to spend. Each one arrived in a different category, filed through a different department, which I later understood wasn't random. It meant each one required a different office to process and respond, multiplying the administrative drag. The 17th complaint was the one that mattered. She'd retained someone. I never found out who, but the work was careful and specific, to review our municipal permits going back to the original conversion. And they found something. The occupancy permit my mother had obtained in 2004 classified the space as an artist live work studio. Under that classification, limited craft production was permitted, but not structured group instruction with paying members of the public, and not retail sales. Over 2 decades of operation, as the business grew from my mother's small classes to what I'd built it into, nobody had ever flagged the permit classification for renewal, because nobody had ever been specifically looking for a reason to. The complaint went to the city's building services department, not the bylaw office. That made it categorically different. That made it the kind of complaint that doesn't close in a week. The city issued an order requiring us to cease retail operations and suspend public classes pending a permit review. The review process, they told me, typically took between 6 and 9 months. I could not carry 9 employees through 6 to 9 months of suspended operations. I tried for 8 weeks. I drew down a line of credit I'd barely touched since incorporating. I applied for a BDC loan and was approved for less than I needed, and more slowly than the situation allowed. I had a conversation with the mortgage holder that I had to have twice, because the first time I wasn't able to say the words clearly enough. On a Thursday morning in March, I sat down with Opal and the rest of the team in the studio and told them what I'd been delaying saying for weeks. I was laying everyone off, effective in 2 weeks, with the maximum severance I could manage. Opal didn't cry this time. She looked at the window for a long time, and then she asked very quietly whether it was her, meaning my neighbor. I said yes. Opal said okay. And we sat there in the studio that still smelled like glaze and clay dust, and I thought about my mother teaching her first class here, with 8 students and a kiln she'd been given instructions for over the phone, and how much distance there was between that morning and this one. I didn't confront my neighbor after the layoffs. I understand how that reads. 17 complaints, a business built across 3 years on 21 years of my mother's foundation, 9 people without work, and I said nothing. But my mother had a way of framing difficult situations that I've never found a better version of. She used to say the person who makes noise gets attention. The person who stays quiet gets time. And time, she said, is the better resource if you know how to use it. So I used it. I took a remote contract doing content strategy for a ceramic supply company in Hamilton. I did it from my kitchen table with a mug of tea, and the particular loneliness of a person who used to run something and now doesn't. In the evenings, I started building what I'd been meaning to build for years, a YouTube channel focused on pottery technique. I called it Thornhill Clay and kept the branding consistent on purpose. I wasn't hiding, I was continuing, just in a different form. Within 5 months, the channel had enough subscribers to monetize. Within 8 months, I was running live virtual workshops through ticketed Zoom sessions, small class sizes, and the waitlist came back, which was surreal and orienting at the same time. Sitting in a bathrobe at 9 in the morning in my own kitchen, and people were registering 2 months out to learn how to center clay through a screen. The permit review concluded 19 months after the order was issued. The city found in the end that the business had operated in good faith under the prior documentation and that the permit classification was simply outdated. They issued a new conditional use permit covering retail and group instruction. It was the right outcome. It came 19 months too late to matter in any practical sense. I had no staff left to bring back, no retail inventory, and not enough capital to restart operations at the scale I'd left. I was sitting with that problem in late October when my accountant Eve called me about something separate. Eve's was methodical in the particular way that certain people from small Quebec towns are methodical. constitutionally unable to leave a spreadsheet with a loose thread. He'd been reviewing comparable property data for my annual filings and had noticed something about the property next door. 3 years of unpaid municipal property taxes, a construction loan in default on a different flip she'd started across town, a second renovation project now stalled mid-build, sitting vacant, accumulating carrying costs with no buyer in sight. Eve mentioned it in exactly the tone he mentioned everything. I don't know if this is directly relevant to you, but... Then he explained the Ontario process. When property taxes go significantly into arrears, the municipality registers a tax arrears certificate. The owner has a defined redemption period to pay in full. If they don't, the city offers the property through public tender, sealed bids, open to any registered buyer, awarded to the highest offer above the minimum established by the outstanding amounts. I asked Eve to pull the county records. I didn't feel what I'd expected to feel reading through them. I'd imagined something satisfying, some clean sense of justice arriving in a document. What I actually felt was a quieter thing, something like tired recognition. She had moved on to other projects after she'd finished with me, because that's what people like that do. The specific target was never the point. The project was. And the next project had gone wrong for reasons that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with her own decisions. I let 2 weeks pass before I said anything to Eve. I wanted to be sure I was making the decision from a clear place rather than a reactive one. Then I asked him to help me put in a tender. We registered under Thornhill Creative Holdings, a numbered company Eves had incorporated for me 2 years earlier to hold the building lease and some wholesale contracts. Not my name, not the studio name. Just a company number on a sealed envelope handed to the city clerk's office on a Tuesday morning in November, when the air smelled like dead leaves in the first real cold of the season. There were 3 other registered bidders, 2 submitted tenders. I'd reviewed the assessed value, the outstanding arrears, and the minimum the city had set, and I wrote a number that felt right the same way centered clay feels right, not because you calculated it, but because you've handled enough of it to know when it's true. The city opened the tenders the following Tuesday. My number was highest. The property was mine. I want to be careful here, because I know what this kind of story is supposed to feel like at this point, and I want to be honest about what it actually felt like. I was sitting across from Eve when we got the call, in his office with the fluorescent lighting and the plant in the corner that always needed watering, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something that was closer to the release at the end of a long breath than anything like victory. The thing I'd been quietly working toward had resolved, and the resolution was a phone call in an accountant's office. That was all. I gave myself 3 days before I went to see her. I didn't plan the timing. I was driving past the block on a Friday afternoon, and I turned onto it and parked. I knocked. She answered quickly, which told me she'd been expecting this. She looked different. The careful presentation was gone. No blazer. The kind of clothes people wear when they've stopped performing a version of themselves. "You're here about the property," she said. Not a question. "I wanted you to hear it from me directly," I said, "not from a letter." She crossed her arms. Old reflex. "I'll challenge the tender. There are grounds." "You can try," I said, and I meant it. She was entitled to whatever legal options she had. Eves has reviewed the statute carefully. The process was followed correctly. "This is about the studio," she said. "You want me to know it's about the studio." I thought about that for a moment. "My mother saved for 21 years to buy that building," I said. "She built something in it over 11 years, and I built something in it for 3 more after her. You spent 14 months filing complaints through every city department you could access, and you did it because you'd made an offer on my building and I said no. So, yes. It's about the studio." She looked at the wall behind me. "I made a business decision," she said. "It wasn't personal." "You hired someone to go through permits from 2004, I said. "That's not a business decision. That's something else." She didn't answer. I hadn't expected her to. "You have 30 days before the transfer finalizes," I said. "I'd use them." There was a pause, and then something shifted in her voice. The performance fell away, and what was underneath it was plain fear. "I've put everything into these properties," she said. There isn't somewhere else to go." I looked at her. I believed her. That's the thing I didn't expect. I believed her, and it didn't change what had happened, and it didn't change what was going to happen, and I felt all 3 of those things at the same time without any of them canceling the others out. I know what it feels like to not have somewhere to go, I said. You made sure I knew that feeling. I laid off 9 people on a Thursday morning, and I remember the sound of that room. She didn't respond. I'll give you 45 days, I said. Not because you've earned it. Because I can afford to be the kind of person who gives it. And I left. The weeks that followed were quieter than I'd anticipated. She retained a real estate lawyer who reviewed the tax sale process and, according to someone who lived 2 houses down and had no reason to filter the information, told her within 10 days that the tender was procedurally clean and there was no viable ground for challenge. The legal file was dropped. Several neighbors who had been carefully polite to her during the complaint years stopped returning her calls once the fuller story made its way around the block, the way things do in neighborhoods that size. Not through gossip exactly, but through the slow filling in of things people had half understood at the time. I didn't discuss any of it publicly. My mother had strong feelings about discretion, and I've kept them. I listed the property with a local agent 47 days after the transfer finalized. I had it assessed, completed the basic necessary maintenance, and priced it at fair market value. The first offer came from a couple in their early 30s. She was a registered nurse at Guelph General. Her partner taught music at a secondary school in Fergus. They'd been trying to buy in the city for 2 years and kept losing out in bidding situations. They didn't know the history of the property. I didn't tell them. They weren't responsible for it, and the house itself had done nothing wrong. They took possession on a Saturday in April. I drove past once, briefly, and saw moving boxes on the front porch and a child's bicycle against the railing, and I thought, good. That's exactly right. The sale proceeds cleared the remaining balance on my mother's original mortgage on the Cardigan Street building, with enough left to fund the studio's rebuild properly. Not rushed, not on a shoestring, but properly. I brought in a contractor who'd worked on heritage buildings before. I had the occupancy classification updated and fully documented by the city before we touched a single room. We spent 9 weeks doing the work correctly instead of quickly. Thornhill Clay reopened on the second Saturday in September. New signage, my mother's handwriting on the logo, traced from a card she'd tucked into one of the binders she left me, the one labeled Glazes, Cone 6, Favorites. Opal came back, which was the outcome I'd been most uncertain about through all of it, and which mattered more than I'd been willing to say out loud. She brought 2 of the former Children's Saturday students with her, teenagers now, who asked if they could volunteer on weekend mornings in exchange for kiln access. I said yes before she'd finished asking the question. We had a waitlist within 3 weeks. I keep the tender envelope in the top drawer of my studio desk. Not as a trophy, I want to be clear about that, but as a reminder of what patience actually looks like from the inside, when it hasn't resolved yet and you're not sure it will. 2 years felt endless while I was living through it. From the outside, it probably looked like I was doing nothing, but I was doing something every single day. Building a revenue stream that didn't need a physical space, saving carefully, watching what was unfolding next door, waiting for the situation to show me its shape before I decided what to do with it. My mother used to say that clay teaches you something beyond technique. She said it teaches you that there is a pace at which things want to move, and if you try to force it faster, you get cracks that don't show up until the kiln, until it's too late and the piece is already broken. Some people will spend months or years finding every lever available to take down what you've built. What they tend not to account for is that the same patience that let you build it in the first place doesn't go anywhere while they're pushing. It waits. And waiting, it turns out, is a skill. One that gets stronger every time someone makes you use it.